Hi, I'm Dylan, and this is episode 3 of the LoLClash review. In memory of everyone's favorite spear-throwing huntress, this episode is going to be focused on Nidalee, Twisted Fate, and some late-game decision-making. I have a really good example of a well-played poke comp from Alliance in the EU LCS, as well as a bunch of games where we can take a look at Twisted Fate's use as a counter to Nidalee. I have games from the Korean LCS showing how the Koreans close out games with Twisted Fate, and in comparison, some games in which NALCS teams struggled in the late game with Twisted Fate. The first clip I have is from Millennium vs Alliance in Week 2 of the EU LCS. I'm going to start with Champion Select here, and it's worth noting that Alliance used the very common strategy nowadays of saving your mid laner for your last pick. This allows them to sort of polarize their team composition with their final pick to counter their enemy. They see that Millennium has a distinct lack of wave clear and really an inability to deal with Nidalee. They don't have a lot of hard engage and they don't have a lot of wave clear. So even though Nidalee is not the greatest matchup against LeBlanc in lane, they go for the Nidalee pick knowing that if they can play their team-wide strategy well, they can probably come out to a win. And we'll see that Alliance just executes this brilliantly. They manage to get a 2v1, which accomplishes a couple things. First of all, it's going to take a little bit of pressure off of the Nidalee in the mid lane. As at least at this point of time, there wasn't a lot of huge mid lane diving like we see nowadays. And it's also going to deny farm to the enemy front line. Like the jungle and the top laner become a lot more weak. And that makes flanking actually a lot harder. So we're going to see how they set up this early siege and end up pretty much almost like checkmating their opponent. They actually have their support and their top laner run in and get deep wards in the top half of the jungle, while Shook is going to go through the bottom half of Millennium's jungle and get 2 deep wards, just all surrounding the mid lane. And just notice how this is timed. The blue buff's coming up soon, and they're going to run into the mid lane with 4 members of their team while keeping farm onto Lucian, because Lucian's going to be a big part of the siege composition coming up. And they're here, and Millennium really doesn't have much that can deal with this. They have a lack of engage, they have a lack of wave clear, and Nidalee's just going to sit there, pick up her blue buff eventually, and keep hucking spears. So a little bit of desperation and probably a bit of a misplay. Krip goes and tries to wave clear with his W. He ends up getting hooked. Shook comes in for the nice first blood, and Alliance ends up picking up a tower and a dragon off of this, and go on to win a really clean game. Although Nidalee's siege compositions were very strong and definitely had their place in the metagame, Korea especially had come up with a bunch of strong counters to counter the Nidalee siege comps, mainly in Yasuo and Twisted Fate. And for the rest of this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the Twisted Fate counter to Nidalee, and how Korean and North American teams have been successful and unsuccessful in using Twisted Fate. The main match I want to focus on is the match C9 played against CLG in the NALCS. In this game, CLG used the Twisted Fate comp really great in the early and mid game and picked up a huge lead, but due to some poor late game decision making, struggled to close it out. CLG once again picks their mid lane last in this draft phase in order to sort of polarize their comp with their final pick. As Cloud9 picks Nidalee and sort of commits himself to at least some level of poke, Counter Logic Gaming goes for the Twisted Fate counter pick that was made very famous in Korea. So C9 in the mid game sets up a pretty standard siege onto the mid lane. Nidalee has blue buff, they have really great vision surrounding their flanks here, and we're going to see CLG show exactly why this Twisted Fate is considered a counter to the Nidalee siege by executing a really great siege breaker dive and flank attack in the mid game. We actually see Dexter comes around from the back. He's going to land a 3-man ultimate. Twisted Fate is going to ultimate into the back line. They're going to get a great pick here, amazing team fight, and they're going to pick up 4 kills and a bunch of objectives off of this. This really set CLG really far ahead. So before we look at why and how CLG ended up losing that game, I want to take a look at the Twisted Fate games from Korea and see how the Samsung teams utilized Twisted Fate in the late game. In the early and mid game, there's a lot of similar sieging and diving by Twisted Fate compositions, but one thing I noticed when reviewing a lot of footage is that in the late game, the Samsung teams use Twisted Fate very, very differently from the North American teams, and I think it's something that will become kind of obvious when we take a look at it. First 2 clips are from Samsung Galaxy Blue versus Najin White Shield. And here we see that Samsung Blue utilizes a lot of quick rotations with Twisted Fate and a lot of movement around the map to utilize A, their poke in this composition, and B, the relative lack of wave clear on the composition of Navsion White Shield. So we see here they push up into the mid lane with their Twisted Fate and their Kog'Maw. And what they're going to do is they're going to rotate 4 members of their team into their opponent's blue side jungle and go to contest their blue buff, which obviously is very important against Nidalee composition. In doing this, they still shove in the mid lane with Lulu and put a lot of pressure in different places upon the map. And using these fast rotations through their enemy's jungle, they actually managed to get a really great pick onto 3 members of Navsion White Shield. Here we see TF ultimates in, lands his gold card, Kha'Zix jumps in, and they end up picking up 3 kills and come out to a pretty good early lead. This is somewhat similar to the sort of plays we see in the early and mid game in North America. I think teams do understand this sort of aggressive play with Twisted Fate, but I think the late game decision making in particular becomes very different when you look at these two teams and how they're going to play. And this next clip just is a few minutes later, but we see how the priorities shift for these Korean teams. This next clip is a little later into the game, and it shows that against this later game Twitch and Rise, Samsung Blue does not overly commit themselves to flank attacks and team fights, and again value pushing sideways and quick rotations through their opponent's jungle in order to create pressure. This also leverages the fact that they have Kog'Maw on their team, who has pretty good poke. Here we see Navsion White Shield setting up in the mid lane for a Nidalee siege, and we're going to see Kha'Zix in the bottom lane is going to start a slow push onto the minion wave, and they're going to coordinate a similar siege break to what we saw in the CLG game. See, Kha'Zix is going to run in here into the bottom lane, start the slow push, and after this slow push is started, Samsung Blue is going to just initiate a sort of long fight onto Navsion White Shield, who is aware of with Nidalee they kind of want to kite back. So Kha'Zix is running in from the bottom side now, and they're setting up this flank attack. And what I want to really pay attention to here is the positioning of this TF ultimate. Instead of teleporting on top of the enemy team, Samsung Blue is clearly prioritizing this wave pushing and a lot of fast rotations, a lot more than they're prioritizing this sort of siege break in the later game. And I think this for a number of reasons I'll talk about after. But we're going to see him get Leona ultimated, immediately Zhonya's. And remember, they still have this bottom lane pushing, so what they're going to do here, realizing that there's a lack of wave clear in Navsion White Shield, and they have pretty good poke with Kog'Maw, they're going to push in this mid lane, run through their opponent's jungle, continue poking over the wall, and run to the bot lane that was already pushing and set up by Kha'Zix. And I think it's really cool that this entire play took a decent amount of planning and strategy to execute, and they end up getting a ton of damage onto their opponents before they finally execute a tower dive, end up picking a bunch of kills, and really strengthen their lead and end up winning this game. The last clip isn't against Nidalee composition, but it shows how these Samsung teams are so aware of their team compositions and what they're capable of, and they utilize their Twisted Fate in a really, really smart way. And this is from the Masters Finals from Samsung Galaxy Ozone versus SK Telecom T1S. And in this game, we see Pawn's Twisted Fate and some really cool map rotations by Samsung Galaxy Ozone. In this clip, they send 4 people to the bottom lane and use the split bow pressure of their Shyvana in the mid lane. This clip's a bit different. SK Telecom T1S has slightly better wave clear, and Samsung Galaxy Ozone really doesn't have as great of a siege composition with Twitch. So what they do is they rotate Twitch into the mid lane and start pushing down the mid lane tower, and they do this really cool cross-map rotation while keeping TF in the bottom lane. And this is just really smart because they know exactly what their team composition is good at, exactly what the opponent's team composition is poor at, and they use the TF ultimate beautifully to set up a really, really smart play. So as TF is still in the bottom lane, he's going to draw a couple of people down to protect the tower. So he's going to actually ghosts here. Pawn ultimates into the mid lane, and the entire team rotates up to the top and executes a awesome tower dive as they have 2 members hiding in the bush. We're going to see Sona flash Crescendo onto Kog'Maw is going to land. Shyvana's going to dive in. Cards over the wall. They pick up a couple kills here, a lot of objectives, and basically close out the game really cleanly off of this play. Before we get into the C9 versus CLG game, I just want to note that there were a lot of individual decisions and individual calls that are just obvious mistakes when you review the game. But I'm more interested in the general approach that CLG took. And I think you'll see a pattern here in the way they you'll see a pattern in what they prioritize in the late game, and that they seem to be committed to this flank strategy against a late game Twitch and a late game Thresh with Mikhail's Crucible. And whereas in the mid game, as we saw in the first clip, it was really effective and gave them a really good early lead, I don't think this is an effective way to actually close out the game when you have Twisted Fate on your team. So the first clip is almost an identical clip, and this is what I love. It's almost an identical clip to one of those Samsung clips. C9 is actually pushing the mid lane inhibitor of CLG, and we CLG actually lands a great Eve ultimate and a good amount of poke on their enemy team, and sort of sends C9 into the defensive, because C9 obviously wants to poke with their Nidalee. But here we see Link goes for the teleport, and whereas in the other clip, I think Dade would have ultimated in a more defensive position and set up for some fast rotations through the enemy jungle, they hard commit to this flank without anyone really there to flank. And it's ineffective. He does pull the red card here. I don't think CLG played his team fight that well, but I'm more interested in the overall priorities that the CLG team seems to have here. And the final clip just shows again just a real committal to these team fights in situations in the late game where I don't think it's as effective. And it's worth noting here, they still have a 6,000 gold lead. Like, this is definitely still a very winnable game for them, and they overcommit themselves to these team fights. They don't seem to be prioritizing split pushing or fast rotations with the TF, and seem pretty it's almost like a one-track mind here on this flank attack that did work in the mid game, but I really don't believe is effective in the late game. Why is that? First of all, characters such as Eve and Renekton in the late game is nowhere near the damage threat in order to kill the opposing AD carry. Second of all, the frontliners and top laners just aren't as strong as they were once. Also, supports are very defensive. We have supports such as Thresh and Morgana that rush Mikhail's and can do a very good job peeling off of very aggressive dive comps if you overcommit. Another disclaimer, there were a lot of mistakes in that game, but if you rewatch the replay from the mid game to about the late game, you will see that CLG really never makes an attempt to use these sort of Korean strategies. Lastly, I have a clip from the game EG played this week against CLG, and it sort of shows, again, a sort of one-track mindedness that these teams have when playing these Siegebreaker compositions. This clip is almost identical to one of the Samsung clips yet again, where the team runs up mid lane, gets a good amount of pressure in a really close game at this point actually, and overcommits to a dive against the opponent's team, whereas I think a Samsung team would have pushed the tower, ran to the bot lane, gotten vision, used their TF ultimate in order to create picks. They once again overcommit to a team fight against an enemy Twitch, and we're going to see a pretty sick ultimate combination from Dexter and Doublelift here. The Cataclysm goes down and the spray, or rat-a-tat-tat, and Doublelift picks up the triple kill. CLG ends up getting, I think, a Baron off of that and a pretty big lead, and EG goes on to lose this game. After comparing the TF clips from Korea versus NA, I think it becomes pretty apparent in the difference in priorities and sort of one-track mindedness that the NA teams seem to have when utilizing Twisted Fate. And I think some of this will come with time. TF hasn't been a while, and as the NA teams study Pawn and Dade's TF a little bit more, I think we'll see a lot more smart, quick rotations with the TF team comps and split pushing. I'm not sure if Nidalee's here to stay. She just got reworked in 4.10, so I'd be interested to see if we see similar interaction in the future. I don't know, who knows? But that's all I have for this episode. I want to thank everyone for watching yet again, and subscribe on YouTube and follow me on Twitter, please. It helps me get out my episode to more people. So thanks, guys.